From the first fire to great empires, and from ancient times to today, this is the story of how humans built our world. Welcome to the entire history of human civilization.
At one point in time, around 3 billion years ago, we were floating around as little tiny atoms in the little petri dish of the world. Fast forward to around 6 million years ago, and we see the emergence of the first hominids, the family of primates that include humans. 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus was the first species to leave Africa and colonize other parts of the world. They had larger brains than their primate ancestors. Around 400,000 years ago, the first evidence of the Neanderthals. Their bodies were adapted to the cold environments of Europe and Western Asia. Their distinctive facial features were some of the most human-like ever seen. Then came us, the only surviving species of the Homo genus. But how did Homo sapiens rise into a global dominance through the mechanism of civilization? We begin our story in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia in 4000 BCE. Nestled between the great Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the Sumerian city of Uruk. Instead of relying on hunting and gathering like our ancestors of the past, the citizens of Uruk were able to develop a way to harvest cereal grains like wheat and barley. However, turning cereal grains into edible foods took a lot of work. In the beginning, they had to use an invention called a hand mill, which consisted of 2 stones. As the grains were crushed between the 2 stones, the flour was collected in a container and stored for future use. This was the start of something great. This complex, strenuous process was our modern world's first example of agriculture. We no longer depended on hunting animals or picking berries for our food. Rather than using human ingenuity, we can create our own food source. This allowed Uruk to prosper into a place with over 50,000 residents. However, this change did have a change on the human body. The average height of men drastically shrunk from 5'9" to 5'3", and for women they shrunk on average from 5'3" to 5 feet. Instead of being the super athletes we were of the past, we were smaller, less noticeable farmers. People also became landlocked, changing the very essence of what it means to be human. In the early 3000 BCE, according to legend, King Gilgamesh began his rule as a Sumerian king of his region. One of the world's earliest poems, the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes the story of Gilgamesh and his quest for immortality. He meets a wise traveler named Utnapishtim, who tells a story of a great flood sent to destroy the world. Towards the poem's end, Gilgamesh says, "Life, which you look for, you will never find. For when gods created man, they let death be his share, and life withheld in their own hands." However, by the end of 3000 BCE, the Akkadians ousted the Sumerians. Sargon the Great took power and conquered all of Sumeria. While in the Indus Valley in modern-day Pakistan, a new civilization was growing. The Indus Valley Civilization, 3300 to 1300 BCE, was most notable for its highly advanced toilet system. The toilets were built with a seat and a chute that led to the underground drainage system. The sewage was then carried away from the homes through a network of covered drains, preventing disease spread. The waste was treated and disposed outside of city limits, helping to keep the cities clean and hygienic. While in Egypt, they were more consumed with building pyramids than basic human plumbing. This was because, in ancient Egyptian religion, it was believed that when a pharaoh was to die in the physical world, his spirit would continue to live on in the afterlife, in which they would continue to rule in perpetuity, and where they would be worshipped by the living. Inside these pyramids, the pharaoh's body was carefully mummified, a process believed to preserve his physical form and help ensure his spirit's journey to the afterlife. The pyramid was also filled with offerings and treasures intended to provide the pharaoh with the resources he would need in the afterlife. Every pharaoh wanted to make sure they were immortal. They wanted to succeed in the afterlife. They wanted to be worshipped forever. That's why it was an utmost priority for Egyptian pharaohs to build pyramids for themselves when laid to rest. It started when Pharaoh Djoser, 2667 to 2648 BCE, built the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, followed by Sneferu, 2613 to 2589 BCE, who built several pyramids, such as the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid. Then came the pharaoh Khufu, 2589 to 2566 BCE, who built the famous Great Pyramid of Giza in a labor-intensive 20-year process, one that the world still marvels at today. Khufu was then followed by pharaohs Khafre and Menkaure, who built the slightly smaller second and third pyramids of Giza respectively. While over in China in the year 2100 BCE, the first Chinese dynasty was upon us. Like the people of Mesopotamia, the Chinese were ever reliant on agriculture, producing rice, wheat, and barley among other crops. However, as legend has it, the Yellow River flooded. These massive floods would destroy all the crops, leading to massive famine and suffering. However, not all was to be lost because Yu the Great was on his way. Yu was so distraught by this problem that he would spend his days traveling up and down the Yellow River. He found ways to divert the rivers by building levees and dikes so that he could regulate the waterways. Then, after 13 years of hard work, the floods could no longer wreak havoc on the land. The people were overjoyed, and Yu was hailed as a savior. That was the start of the first Chinese dynasty, the Jia dynasty. Though the accuracy of this tale is questioned by historians, it does establish an important precedent. The idea is that power ought to follow one's merit. An individual who deserves absolute power shall have absolute power. This idea would shape the world for years to come and cause the people of ancient China to follow him to create the first ever Chinese dynasty. While back over in Mesopotamia, around 1772 BCE, a Babylonian king named King Hammurabi created the basis of the legal system as we know it today. Hammurabi ordered the creation of a 7-foot-tall, 2-foot-wide stone slab. Written on it was a system of 282 laws that each citizen of his kingdom was to follow. Such laws included various laws such as Law 1, if a man brings an accusation against another man, charging him with murder but cannot prove it, the accuser shall be put to death. Law 196, if a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. Law 197 says, if he breaks another man's bone, they shall break it. Law 199, if he destroys the eye of a man's slave or breaks the bone of a man's slave, he shall pay 1/2 his price. However, what King Hammurabi did was create a society based on laws. He laid out strict laws, placing people into certain castes of life and value. Everyone was worth a different amount based on what class they were in society. There was no illusion of equality in ancient Babylon. Instead, it was pretty clear the value of a noble's bone was worth more than a plebeian's, which in turn was worth more than a slave's. An idea we continue to see throughout history. While in modern-day Turkey, a lesser-known civilization came to power. The Hittites Empire under the charismatic rule of the leader Labarnus, 1680 to 1650 BCE. He was a skilled ruler with a single vision in mind, uniting the Hittite city-states under a single rule. Labarnus led his army from city to city, conquering neighboring city-states and making alliances with their leaders. He was a shrewd diplomat, and he used his diplomatic skills to win over the hearts and minds of the people. Eventually, Labarnus became the ruler of all the Hittite city-states and established the empire. He was a just and fair ruler and was loved by his people. Under his rule, the Hittites prospered, and their territory expanded, leaving them right next to their neighbors in Egypt. While in modern-day Greece, a collection of city-states emerged on the European continent. Mycenaean Greece, 1600 BCE to 1100 BCE, was dominated by an elite warrior society and consisted of a network of palace-centered states that developed rigid hierarchical, political, social, and economic systems. At the head of this society was the king. However, unlike a unified civilization, each city was on its own. A city-state is a city that, with its surrounding territory, forms an independent state. The development of city-states such as Troy, Mycenae, and Pylos start to grow. The first remnants of the Greek written language, known as Linear B, also started to emerge. The first record of any Indo-European Greek record we have today. While back in Egypt, they started to create a social pyramid of another type, the Egyptian social pyramid. Like the Great Pyramid of Giza, it is more prominent at the bottom and tinier at the top. At the bottom lays the peasants and the slaves. They were responsible for doing all the manual labor. They worked on the lands. They would spend the day in and day out farming, producing food for all of Egypt. Then, when the season to farm was over for the year, they would work on the pharaoh's massive building projects, literally building the pyramids. Slightly above the slaves came the artisans. They were the stonemasons, the plasters, and the sculptors who created the exuberant art the wealthy desired, and for Egypt is most known for today. Then came the merchants, who spent their days navigating the Nile, trading gold, papyrus, and linen to anyone who could afford it. They were well respected and able to make a healthy profit by selling. Then came the scribes. These masters of the world would go to specialized scribe schools just to master the language of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. In practical use, these scribes took account of the stores of food, various tax documents, and even the daily lives of the pharaoh. After the scribes came the soldiers. The soldiers were tasked with protecting the Egyptian empire. They dedicated their lives to defend or make preemptive strikes against their enemy. Generally, they were well fed. Then, near the top, came the bureaucrats. These high-ranking government officials did essential tasks at the top of society, like the viziers, who ran the logistical tasks necessary to run a civilization. The priests oversaw taking care of the temples to ensure the gods were well cared for. The nobles oversaw specific regions of the empire and kept order in said regions. At the top, the purpose of everyone below was the pharaoh, the king and the mediator between the gods and the world of men. The pharaohs will be known to be supreme, and all must succumb to it. When the pharaoh dies, he will be buried in a pyramid in which he will help eternally rule over the Egyptian empire. Egyptian society was created to serve the pharaoh. Taxes were taken from the farmers for the pharaoh, and artisans made unique crafts for it. The merchants ensured the pharaoh was well supplied with the needed goods. The scribes would follow the pharaoh and record his thoughts. The soldiers made sure his empire was protected. The bureaucrats did the jobs the pharaoh couldn't do, while the pharaoh sat at the top and communicated with the gods. Pharaoh Ramses II, 1279 to 1213 BCE, accomplished many extraordinary things by living in this social system. He orchestrated the construction of the Temple of Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, and the Temple of Karnak. He was also able to grow the Egyptian empire and reconquer lands lost by other pharaohs, except for the land claimed by the Hittite Empire. The Hittite king of the time, Mtwali II, 1295 to 1272 BCE, was notorious for ordering his troops to attack his Egyptian neighbors. Following the example of Labarnus, Mtwali wanted to unify the world under Hittite rule. However, Ramses had enough. Other pharaohs in the past have tried to stop the Hittites, but he knew if his empire was to ever succeed, he needed to attack back. His target is the city of Kadesh. Ramses rode in on his chariot with 4 divisions of 20,000 men ready to dominate and kill Mutwalli. However, the Hittites already knew of the incoming Egyptian invasion through espionage. They fortified their city with 40,000 of his own men. A war was about to commence. Ramses decided to split up his divisions to force Mutwalli out, but yet Mutwalli never did. A gruesome mistake. Splitting up his forces left him exposed, unable to get an advantage, allowing Mutwalli and the people of Kadesh a chance for victory. Historians believe that all they did was come out from the fortification of Kadesh and trap Ramses II's forces in his army by the river. But yet, for some unknown reason, they never did, leaving the Battle of Kadesh to end in a draw. After the battle, though, both sides decided it would be best to stop attacking each other, that they should live in peace and unity in this world. Then, after the death of Mutwalli, the new king Hattusili III took the throne of the Hittite Empire. Through the means of messengers in the year 1258 BCE, both Ramses and Hattusili signed the first peace treaty to ever exist. Reading in part, Ramses the great king, the king of the country of Egypt, shall never attack the country of Hatti to take possession of a part of this country. And Hattusili, the great king of the country of Hatti, shall never attack the country of Egypt to take possession of a part of that country. Then, a period of friendship occurred between these two once warring nations. The Hittites were skilled in metalwork and taught the Egyptians to make superior weapons and tools. At the same time, the Egyptians, master of agriculture, shared their knowledge with the Hittites, trade for the benefit of both civilizations. Both civilizations prospered because of this. Peace can lead to prosperity. The agreement was kept in place until around 1200 BCE because that's when the Hittite Empire fell, because of the constant attacks they faced from the Sea People, leaving the Hittite Empire to be lost in the state of history. While on a continent far away, the first civilization in the Americas was taking foot in modern-day Mexico. The Olmec civilization, 1200 BCE to 400 BCE, is often considered the mother civilization of Native American civilizations. However, sadly though, not much is known about them, mainly due to their writing in a hieroglyph historians still can't decipher. One of the few remains we have are these 17 colossal stone heads. In Mesoamerican culture, there is this belief that the head alone could contain an individual's emotion, experience, and soul. We may not know their leaders' names like of other civilizations, like Ramses and Hammurabi. When looking through the eyes of a stone head, we can still feel their presence. And in some ways, they remain immortal, enshrined in history, for one day we may learn who they are. While in the east, the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE, in China was taking its stride. The Zhou dynasty gained power because of the failures of the less critical Shang dynasty. They believed in the idea of a mandate from heaven. This resulted in 4 principles in the Chinese dynastical structure that would be repeated repeatedly. 1. Heaven grants the emperor the right to rule. 2. Since there is only one heaven, there can only be one emperor at any given time. 3. The emperor's virtue determines his right to rule. And 4. No one dynasty has a permanent right to rule. A ruler in dynasty could lose the mandate from heaven, and the heavens weren't always on the side of the rulers. Over time, it will fade into another dynasty. The heavens would send signs of droughts, famines, floods, and earthquakes across the land, signaling they'd lost the blessing from above. This is how the Shang dynasty fell, and the Zhou dynasty grew to prominence. The Zhou dynasty brought another style of government and the creation of feudalism. The system was straightforward, leading to another social pyramid. At the bottom lay the peasants, who were tied to the land and whose job was to produce crops for the empire. Then came the soldiers, whose job was to protect the lands from foreign invaders. Then the lords, who owned the land and taxed the peasants a portion of their crops, who in turn, the lord gave some of their crops to the king. The person in charge of the whole empire, the king, would then receive more crops and become very wealthy. All profits go to the king, and all work goes to the masses. Why would anyone just settle for a life of farming day in and day out? There are two reasons for this phenomenon. The first reason was due to necessity. It took many more people to feed an empire and a family back then. And the second reason being philosophy. Towards the end of the Zhou dynasty, the beginning of Eastern philosophy was created. Confucius created a philosophy system justly named Confucianism, which is focused on the importance of respect, loyalty, and responsibility in all relationships in life. A central concept of Confucianism is called Li, which can be translated as rituals, customs, or manners. Li refers to the formal and informal social conventions that guide societal behavior. It is seen as maintaining order and harmony in social relationships, while Lao Tzu created another philosophy called Taoism. The word Tao means the way or the path, and Taoism teaches that individuals should seek to align themselves with the natural flow of the universe, rather than fighting against it. Live your life as peacefully with yourself as possible, and don't worry about external things outside your control. Just focus on your farming. One of the most famous contemporaries from Taoism is the idea of yin and yang, representing complementary and interdependent forces in nature, such as light and dark, hot and cold, or masculine and feminine. Taoism teaches that by balancing these opposing forces, individuals can achieve harmony and fulfillment. Confucianism and Taoism made life bearable for ancient Chinese farmers. But as time progressed, the city-states that occupied ancient Greece grew. Around 800 BCE, the Greek city started to realize that the land they occupied was practically infertile, so to produce an essential staple of grain, they had to import it. Hence why the Greek states had to colonize the world around them. The city-state Miletus, at its height, had over 90 colonies throughout Europe, producing food for the Greeks. At its height, the Greek had set up colonies from modern-day Marseille in France to Rostov-on-Don in Russia. One of these new emerging city-states was Rome. As legend has it, Romulus and Remus were twin brothers abandoned by their parents and placed into the river Tibet. As the basket floated across the river, a female wolf discovered the two orphans and nursed them back to health. When Romulus and Remus became adults, they decided to find a city where the wolf rescued them. However, this created turmoil as both brothers wanted the site to be named after themselves. As Romulus and Remus fought relentlessly, eventually Romulus came up with the final blow and killed Remus, creating Rome in 753 BC. While the Greek city-states might have been colonizing, Cyrus the Great was about to take over an empire. At the time, the Persians were subjugated to the rule of the Medes Empire. According to legend, after his grandson Cyrus was born, King Astyages of Medes had a vivid dream that his little grandson would one day stage a revolt against him. King Astyages knew what to do and ordered his chief advisor to kill the baby. But the chief advisor gave the baby off to a shepherd to be raised instead. However, troubles weren't over for Cyrus. When he was 10, King Astyages found Cyrus. King Astyages wanted to kill him because the dream was very clear. This man will revolt against you. Yet, against his better senses, Cyrus was allowed to live. King Astyages' biggest mistake. When Cyrus was a man, he gathered his army and revolted against his maternal grandfather. The two, but as prophecy had it, Astyages surrendered in 550 BCE. However, Cyrus wasn't done conquering. He conquered Babylon and became the supreme ruler of Mesopotamia and even the Indus Valley civilization. The world was in Cyrus's hand. Cyrus then took over the Greek colony of Ionia in Asia Minor, leading a great Persian empire, and then he died. leaving it all in the air for the next great Persian king, Darius the Great. While back in Greece, various city-states started to gain power, but two were at the forefront: Sparta and Athens. Sparta was a military powerhouse. The famous Spartans believed everything should focus on physical strength and war. When a new young Spartan was born, it would be slaughtered if it didn't look healthy. Boys were taken from their families at a young age and were trained to become soldiers. The brutal training included physical conditioning, weapons training, and harsh living conditions. The entire life of a Spartan was to win a war. Their society reflects it with three main groups. The ruling class consisted of aristocrats who held political power, the free non-citizens who were not allowed to participate in government but were still expected to serve in the military, and the helots, a group of enslaved people that provided labor for the Spartan state. Life in Sparta was harsh, brutal, and militaristic. While their neighbors up north were experimenting with this idea of democracy, Athenian democracy was a highly complicated mess. There were two branches, the Council of 500 and the Assembly. The Council of 500 was selected randomly by a process known as sortition. Athens itself was made up of 10 different tribes. Each tribe was responsible for providing 50 citizens to serve for 1 year in the Council of 500 via random selection. Each eligible citizen would be given a personalized token. Those tokens were inserted into a particular machine called a clariterion. This long-lost technology included tubes and balls, which somehow selected 50 residents of each tribe to join the illustrious Council of 500. While in the Assembly, there was a system in place that said that every single citizen had a vote. Of course, to be a citizen, you had to be a male and not a slave, and either born in Athens or to Athenian parents. The Council of 500 would create the agenda for the main assembly to vote on because over 30,000 people could have a vote at any given time. It was total chaos. So to quell this, the council would nominate 9 presidents the morning of the meeting, and it was their job to ensure all the rules and procedures were being followed. Since they were appointed right before the assembly met, they were almost impossible to bribe. Somehow, the assembly would loudly vote on whether a bill would pass. They would vote on matters like appointing generals, various laws, and other government bureaucracy. However, not everyone liked this Athenian democracy. The famous Greek philosopher Plato thought the idea was barbaric. In Book 6 of his seminal book, The Republic, Plato writes, "The true navigator must study the seasons of the year, the sky, the stars, the winds, and all the other subjects appropriate to his profession if he is really fit to control the ship. Think that it's quite impossible to acquire the professional skill needed for such control, and that there's no such thing as the art of navigation." How much could a randomly selected member of the Council of 500 really know? How much could he fully contribute to society? Should we allow a random member of society to have any power? Instead, Plato would advocate for the idea of a philosopher king, a man who studies wisdom, logic, and reasoning, a man who dedicates his life to understanding how to be just, a man who will become the navigator of wisdom. Plato would rather say, the society we have described can never grow into a reality or see the light of day, and there will be no end to the troubles of the states, or indeed, my dear Glaucon, of humanity itself, till philosophers become rulers in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers, and political power and philosophy thus come into the same hands. There's just one issue with Plato's quote. Every leader thinks they're a philosopher king. Everyone thinks their thoughts are the best. Everyone thinks their ideas are the wisest. From Yu the Great in China, to Labarnus of the Hittite Empire, to Siddhartha Gautama of the Kingdom of Magadha in India. While not so far away, in the Indian Kingdom of Magadha, a spoiled prince named Siddhartha Gautama, 500 BCE, lived in luxury inside a palace. Inside this palace, Siddhartha could have anything he wanted. All the jewels, all the wealth, all the finest goods thrust upon him. His world inside of the palace was a utopia on Earth. There was no want, need, or desire, and it was perfect. Until he went outside his palace compound, the only place he ever knew. As he took his first steps outside of his palace, what he saw struck a chord. He saw an old man dying right on the street in front. He realized that the human experience wasn't something that was perfect and sublime. Instead, it was death. As Gilgamesh realized many years ago, this was an inevitable part of the human experience. Siddhartha left his life of luxury behind and began a quest for knowledge and enlightenment. He studied with spiritual teachers and meditated for many years, searching for answers to life's big questions. Finally, after 6 years of seeking, he sat down under a fig tree and meditated until he achieved enlightenment. Enlightenment is a state of inner peace, in which one has transcended the limitations of the ego and is in touch with a universal consciousness or divine essence. It isn't a fixed and permanent thing, but rather an ongoing process of growth and development. But under that fig tree, Siddhartha became known as the Buddha, or the Awakened One. He would spend the rest of his life traveling the countryside, becoming close to the enlightenment. Darius was determined to follow in his father's footsteps and take over the world. After finalizing their rule over the city-state of Ionia, the Persians were on a quest to take over Greece. Darius and his 20,000 men came to the city of Marathon in the year 490 BCE, a city 26.2 miles away from Athens. The Athenians were vastly outnumbered, with only 10,000 men. As the Persians were trying to regroup, the powerful Greek hoplites crushed the weaker Persian foot soldiers by routing the wings before turning towards the center of the Persian line. The remnants of the Persian army fled to their ships and left the battle. Early historians believe the battlefield littered 6,400 Persian bodies, while the Athenians lost only 192. So the Persians retreated, and an Athenian messenger named Pheidippides ran the 26.2 miles from Marathon to Athens, exclaiming with joy how the Athenians just beat the mighty Persian Empire. All of Athens went crazy with this fantastic news, hence leading the Pheidippides' historic trek to be sketched into history as the world's first marathon. However, the Persians weren't done, even with Darius I dying of mysterious circumstances. His son, Xerxes I, took over the crown and wanted to complete his grandfather's legacy. In 480 BCE, Xerxes I wanted revenge, so he brought his enormous invasion force of over 100,000 soldiers and was dead set on conquering Greece. Then, at a narrow pass at Thermopylae, the Spartan king Leonidas had his force of 7,000 Spartans maintain the defense. Leonidas knew of his disadvantage and developed a bold and daring plan to defeat the Persians. Rather than waiting for the Persians to attack, Leonidas ordered his soldiers to make a surprise attack on the Persian camp, catching the Persians off guard and disrupting their formation. Despite their success, the Greek army was ultimately overwhelmed by the Persians, who attacked from all sides and eventually broke through the Greek defenses. Leonidas and his soldiers fought with courage and determination. Still, they were ultimately defeated. Then came the Battle of Salamis, where the Greeks could change the tilt of the war in a naval battle between the 500 Persian trireme and 300 Greek trireme. It didn't look good for the Greeks. Still, the great Athenian general, Themistocles, employed his plan to move the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis and hit the enemy fleet so hard that it had nowhere to retreat. After a massive sea battle, Themistocles won Greece the victory and changed the face of the war. The Persians still had their goal: conquer the Greek city-states. Xerxes had returned to Persia, leaving Persian general Mardonius in charge of the Persian force for most of the significant battle yet. After diplomatic talks ceased, Persia knew they had to attack. As the Persians sent their troops to Plataea, the Greeks knew they had to work together. With 30 various Greek city-states working together, they were able to field a massive 110,000 hoplite army with the primary purpose of defeating Persia, though that was nothing compared to the estimated 150,000-man army of Persia. The battle was fierce and intense, with both sides fighting with ferocity and determination. The Greek hoplites continued to be effective against the Persian cavalry and archers. The Greeks also strategically used the terrain, fighting on a slope that helped offset the Persian numerical advantage. In the end, the Greeks defeated the Persian forces and secured a decisive victory. The Persians suffered heavy losses, and Mardonius was killed in the fighting. The Battle of Plataea marked the end of the Greco-Persian Wars and the Persian threat to Greece. After the Persian War, life in ancient Greece was spectacular. A golden age of culture was upon us. With no longer having to face the threat of war, Athens was able to create architectural wonders, such as the Parthenon. The Parthenon sits upon the Athenian Acropolis, a prominent hill overlooking the city of Athens, to show its wealth and culture. No matter where you'll go in Athens, you can still see the Great Parthenon even today. Then came the theater. Around this time, the state would sponsor the most significant poets to create stories in the Athenian festival, called the City Dionysia, a festival designed to worship the Greek god of theater and fertility, Dionysus, creating playwrights such as Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes. States were hungry for power. Athens was recruiting city-states into their Delian alliance, while Sparta was recruiting city-states into their Peloponnesian alliance. Both Sparta and Athens felt like they should control the city of Korkia, hence why in 434 BCE, war was upon the Greek peninsula, resulting in naval battles such as the Battle of Siblos and the Battle of Pylos. By 421 BCE, a short peace was negotiated. However, this peace would not last, and Athens had their eyes on Sicily. Initially, the expedition was going well. The Athenians established alliances with several Sicilian cities, and won several minor skirmishes against the Sicilian forces. But soon, Alcibiades, one of the greatest naval generals in history, was recalled to Athens to face charges of sacrilege. The Athenian fleet was left without his leadership. In his absence, the expedition began to unravel. The Athenians could not take the city of Syracuse, which had fortified its defenses and was well prepared for a siege. The Sicilians were aided by reinforcements from Sparta, which saw an opportunity to strike a crippling blow against its arch-rival Athens. The Athenians suffered from a lack of supplies and were plagued by disease. At the same time, the Syracusans launched a series of surprise attacks and ambushes. Finally, after months of grueling fighting, the Athenian fleet was destroyed in a decisive battle. Thousands of Athenians were killed, and many more were captured and enslaved. A decade after that, Athens fell to the Spartans. The age of legendary Greece was now over. Both Athens and Sparta were significantly weaker, never to regain the same power they once had, leaving the world ready for a philosopher king to conquer it all. Then, in the east, the mandate of heaven was up. The Zhou dynasty, after a long 800-year rule, it was deemed by the heavens that their empire was up, which led to a period known as the Warring States, 474 to 221 BCE. This resulted in Han Fizi, who created a new philosophy called legalism. Followers of legalism believed that people were inherently selfish and would only act in their own self-interest, and that the only way to keep them in line was through a system of rewards and punishments that was clear and consistently enforced. This resulted in Fizi claiming that the best way to achieve social order was by establishing a powerful ruler responsible for enforcing the law and punishing wrongdoers. He also believed the ruler should have complete control over the military, the economy, and society. While in the heart of the Oaxaca region of Mexico, the Zapotec civilization started to flourish. The capital city of Monte Alban was being built on a mountaintop overlooking the entire Oaxaca Valley. Perched on the mountaintop overlooking the Valley of Oaxaca, the city was home to a ruling elite who oversaw a hierarchical social structure that included middle-class artisans and lower-class farmers. The people of the Zapotec civilization were known for their innovative agricultural practices, including the cultivation of maize and other crops, which sustained their communities in times of drought and other environmental pressures. They also developed an early writing system, which used a combination of symbols and glyphs to represent words and ideas. They developed an advanced calendar system based on 260-day and 365-day solar cycles. In Greece, during the year 356 BCE, in the city of Pella in the Kingdom of Macedon, the greatest commander in history was born. Alexander the Great grew up knowing he would be a leader, and was the son of King Philip II and Queen Olympia. But the teacher was much more impressive. Since he was a kid, Alexander was tutored by Aristotle. Aristotle is the man who is known as the father of logic. He created the fields of biology and taxonomy by introducing a way to think called the scientific method, a method that is still taught in schools to this day. He also wrote extensively about philosophy, ethics, and art, changing the face of the world as we know it today. This is the man who was in charge of teaching Alexander the Great. Alexander was 20 when his father was assassinated, but his excellent education allowed him to take over the rest of the world. After his father died in 336 BCE, Alexander was hell-bent on keeping his family's power. So when the Greek city of Thebes decided to revolt, Alexander and his army marched 240 miles in 14 days. When Thebes refused to surrender, he razed the entire city to the ground, and 6,000 were killed, and the rest were sold into slavery. The rest of the Greek city-states recoiled in fear, allowing Alexander to do as he pleased, leaving for his new target to be Persia and the new Persian king, Darius III. In 333 BC, Alexander faced the Persian army at the Battle of Issus. This significant engagement saw the Persian king Darius III defeated and forced to flee. Alexander then captured several key cities, including the vital port of Tyre, which had resisted his initial siege. In 331 BC, Alexander faced Darius III again at the Battle of Gaugamela, near the Tigris River in modern-day Iraq. Despite being outnumbered, Alexander won a decisive victory using superior tactics and mobility. The Persian army was shattered, and Darius III fled once again. Alexander then proceeded to capture the Persian capital of Babylon and took control of much of Mesopotamia. He continued his campaign eastward, winning battles in what is now modern-day Iran and Afghanistan. In 330 BC, he captured the Persian capital of Persepolis, a city of great wealth and cultural significance. But Alexander wasn't done. He wanted to expand eastward, eventually crossing the Hindu Kush Mountains into India. However, his troops grew tired of the endless fighting and refused to go any further, and Alexander was forced to turn back. However, after Alexander failed in the Indian subcontinent, a powerhouse emerged in India called the Mauryan Empire. At its height, it spanned over much of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. However, this conquering came at much of a cost for its leader Ashoka the Great. In 261 BC, after the death of his parents, Ashoka decided that his empire needed to expand. In his sights, the kingdom of Kalinga. The war was bloody, the war was fierce. Over 100,000 people died. Ashoka couldn't sleep with himself. He didn't know how to deal with his actions that resulted in so much death. So he turned to the teaching of the Buddha. Under Ashoka's rule, The Mauryan Empire became known for supporting Buddhist teachings and promoting nonviolence. Ashoka issued a series of edicts inscribed on rocks and pillars throughout the empire that promoted principles such as kindness, respect for all religions, and the abolition of slavery. Certain traits were not shared in the West by Alexander.